third and final section of ROA data collection is the student section. And for this area, we're going to start by looking at the data template first, as it's a little easier way to visualize the data. You can see that the template, like every other section, it's broken into columns and rows, each row being a particular student, and the columns being the information specific to that individual. The first column is the student ID. We ask you to provide us a unique identifier for that student that follows them from one year to the next. It's important that we know, for example, that student in row 2, 1167555, is the same individual year over year, as that impacts the retention rate we calculate for ROA Insights. Additionally, it's important that the student ID is not something like the student's social security number or the student's first and last name or things like that, as it's important that we keep this information de-identified. Column B, the race and ethnicity column, is an optional column. You can choose whether or not you do it as an institution. We do offer a drop-down function for consistent naming, which makes the upload process much easier. But the intent is for you to not go row by row and use the drop-down menu. It's to copy and paste or use other functionality to fill out the right information for those individuals. Column C, which is the first generation student column, is also optional. It's got a drop-down function like race and ethnicity, so it's a yes or no question. Yes, they're first generation, or no, they're not. And again, you can copy and paste or do a different function to fill out this information should you choose. Tuition classification is a required piece of information for every student. Each student needs a tuition classification, because what this does is it tells us what tuition rate, that ties back to the institution information you provided, what tuition rate applies to that particular individual. We do offer the drop-down structure so you can see what that naming was without having to bounce back and forth between the institution tab or the student tab, so that you can fill out this information as needed. You can see a number of the people in this example are traditional tuition rate, which is common for most athletic departments, but we do have a graduate student here among the mix as well. Room classification, again, also tying back to the institution page. You're telling us what type of room situation applies to that student. They were traditional on campus, they were off campus, or NA is that neither field applies to them. Board classification is the same. Again, you're telling us what board type applies to that student. Are they traditional? Are they off campus? Or does neither apply? And you can see how that's filled out here with the different individuals. Column G is the academic exempt column. And what you're telling us in this area is if a type of exemption based on NAIA rules applies to that student. So the financial aid exemptions are a full GPA exemption, a half GPA exemption, a full freshman exemption, and a half freshman exemption. And there are different criteria to qualify for these exemptions that are laid out in the NAIA official handbook. As you can see, not every student qualifies for these exemptions. If they do not, you can just leave it blank. But obviously if they do, you need to fill out that information as appropriate. The next 5 columns are specific aid types. In these areas, you're providing us aid before exemptions are applied, and you're providing it in the categories of athletic aid, academic aid, need-based aid, work study, or other institutional aid. Have your mindset being institutional aid and thinking NAIA accountable aid rules. Things like Pell Grants and other government grants or student loans are not reported within these numbers. It's just that institutional and countable aid type figures. So to be fully transparent with you, the academic and athletic aid columns are frequently used by most institutions. Need-based and work study are more infrequent. And then other is just kind of a catch-all column for unique things that your institution does, or things that don't necessarily fit within the athletic or academic aid category. A common form of other institutional aid that is also NAIA accountable aid is, say you've got a women's soccer player that's a resident assistant and they receive a room waiver. You would report the value of that room waiver as other institutional aid. Column M, is specific to a description of the other aid. This is an optional column. If you choose to fill this out, you can, and it just provides us some details on what that other institutional aid might be. The next column, column N, is the enrollment date, but really what this is asking for is the term in which the student started at your institution. You can see the student in row 2 started in the spring of the 18-19 academic year, or the student in row 3 started in the fall of the 15-16 academic year. Similarly to the other sections, we offer the drop-down function. You can see a number of different fall, spring, summer terms, but as you go far enough down, you also see different quarters. So if you are a quarter school, you can do that. It is important that you follow this consistent naming structure when it comes to the enrollment terms. Graduation semester and quarter. You're telling us the term in which that student graduated from your institution if it occurred within that given year. You can see that there are a number of blanks within this column that you can just see here on the screen. Those are students that did not graduate within that academic year. You're only reporting students that graduated within that academic year. So in the case of this first year of ROA reporting, only within the 19-20 academic year. The final academic term enrolled column has provided some confusion in the past. The intent of this column is for you to provide us the term in which a student left the institution but did not graduate. So for example, this student in row 136 left the institution after the fall 18-19 or during the fall 18-19 semester, but did not graduate. They just left the institution. They could have transferred, they withdrew, whatever. That's what you're providing here. As you can see, a number of these fields are blank. That's meaning those students are expected to return or did return to a given campus, or they had information in the graduation column. You don't have to provide a final academic term enrolled if you've got a graduation semester and quarter. Column Q is the reason a student left the institution. There's a very small drop down with a couple different options of transferred, other, or unknown. This is an optional column, so don't feel like you have to fill it out. But some schools were wanting to track on why students were leaving the institution. Columns R through the end of the spreadsheet, through I believe it's BN, are the different sports. It's important for upload purposes that you do not delete any columns within this student template. Just leave them or hide them if a sport doesn't apply to you. So for example, if you don't have a men's or women's bowling program, you can just hide those columns so that you don't get confused by them being there. Within each sports area, and I'll filter the sport of baseball as an example. Within each sport area, you are providing the level of competition for the students within that sport, and there are 3 categories. There's competing varsity students, there's non-competing varsity students, and there's non-varsity students. Competing varsity students are those whose aid counts towards the upper limits. Non-competing varsity students are students who were on the varsity roster, but their aid does not count towards the financial aid upper limits. And then non-varsity students are those students who might be junior varsity, or maybe it's a student manager that's part of the athletic department and receives aid as such, but they also do not count towards the upper limits. A key thing of note within the student section is that you should not have duplicate student IDs. An ID is specific to a student, and if they're a multi-sport student, you would label them as such. You would say in the same row that they competed in 2 different sports and at what levels. And this then tells the program that their age should be divided 50-50 in this example between baseball and men's basketball. So that is the template of the student section. Let's take a look at the online forms. So we go into the student section. And if you're looking to add a student, you click this white box, say add a student, and it brings up the student form. And as you can see in the student form, you see the exact same values that you see in the student, or in the student template, excuse me. So once you fill this information out, you click save or save and return, and it would add that student to your roster of students in ROA. That could be pretty time consuming. I recommend uploading the spreadsheet. And when you upload the spreadsheet, again, you select the proper file, you select upload, the wheel will spin for a minute, and then once this gets done thinking, or loading that information, it will populate the page with the students that you provided in the spreadsheet. It will also tell you if you have any errors or warnings in the information you provided. Errors and warnings are, in a sense, are some intelligence that are built into the system. And it just tells you, hey, this looks a little wrong. That's what warnings might do, is they might say, hey, this information looks a little odd. Are you sure that it's correct? Where an error is in red and will tell you, you have to fix this before you finish. So you can see I've uploaded my data. I can see all of my students. There were 254 of them, and I can see what sports they play in. If I select a particular student, it opens up that student form, and then I can specifically see how I filled out each of those fields in my template, or make any edits that I might need to. If you'd like, the top of the student page allows you to filter by sport, so you can look specifically at your men's basketball program. So it filters that information down to 15 of 254, and you can see those 15 individuals on your page. You can go back to if you click the blank, it'll take you back to viewing all of your students. So say you want to look at the warnings. So you can see that, okay, I've got a warning in my data here at the top, and I click to see details. I've got 5 students whose aid is more than the tuition. This doesn't mean that you broke any rules. It's just we add this warning in to say, hey, is it right that this student received more financial aid than what their tuition rate was? Per NAIA rules, you can scholarship up to the full cost of attendance, but traditionally, the tuition rate is a large chunk of that. If you know this information is accurate, you can click this box to dismiss all warnings, or you can go into each student and dismiss the warning there. So let's say we know this is accurate, and we dismiss the warnings. The page will think for a few seconds, and then all the warning triangles that you would have seen previously in your list of students have now disappeared because you've cleared that information. Once you feel like you've completed your student information, you click the return button. This will then navigate you back to the data collection home screen, and you can see that now that you've filled out all 3 sections completely without any errors or warnings, the submit button is now illuminated. You click that submit button and it sends your data to the NAIA National Office, and you've completed report requirements.